Most people spend their entire careers trying to be good at what they do. They learn the skills, they hit the benchmarks, and they follow the rules. But in a world driven by optimization and automation, being good at your job is no longer a guarantee of security. If you can be easily defined by a job description, you can be easily replaced by anyone else who reads the same description. To become truly indispensable, we have to change the game entirely. We have to shift from thinking about what we do to how and why we do it. It is not about becoming a cog that turns faster. It is about becoming the linchpin that holds the machine together. Here are 10 ways to shift that perspective and make yourself fundamentally harder to replace. First, master the hidden context. Every organization has two structures: the formal chart on paper and the actual web of human relationships that makes things happen. The people who are impossible to replace are the ones who understand the unwritten rules, the unspoken frustrations, and the real motivations of the team. When you understand the context, you stop just executing tasks and start solving the real underlying problems before anyone else even sees them. Second, become the chief dots connector. In a highly specialized world, most people sit in their own silos looking down at their specific tasks. If you can lift your head up, look across departments, and connect the dots between engineering and marketing, or sales and product development, you create immense value. Individuals who can bridge gaps and synthesize fragmented information become the vital translation layer of a company. Third, take radical accountability for the gray areas. Every company has projects or problems that fall into the cracks, things that are nobody's job, but everyone's headache. When you willingly step into those gray areas and say, "I'll figure this out," you relieve massive pressure from leadership. People who look for ownership rather than waiting for permission are the ones leaders realize they cannot live without. Fourth, build trust, not just a track record. Competence gets you in the door, but trust keeps you there. Anyone can learn a skill, but not everyone can be trusted to handle a crisis. Tell the hard truth with empathy, or support a teammate when the stakes are high. When your team and your leaders know that your word is absolute and your intentions are selfless, they will protect your position because you protect the culture. Fifth, become an active institutional memory. It is one thing to know how to do a process today. It is another to understand why the process was created in the first place. When you accumulate deep institutional knowledge, the history of past failures, the evolution of client relationships, the logic behind old decisions, you prevent the company from repeating costly mistakes. You become a living archive that cannot be easily downloaded or taught in an onboarding week. Sixth, optimize for the success of others. True indispensability is paradoxically counterintuitive. The harder you try to protect your own knowledge to keep yourself safe, the more expendable you become because you limit the team. But when you actively mentor others, share your shortcuts, and lift the baseline of the entire room, you become a multiplier. Leadership will never replace a person who makes everyone around them twice as good. Seventh, master the art of calm under pressure. When panic sets in, whether it is a lost client, a missed deadline, or a sudden market shift, most people look around for reassurance. If you can train yourself to absorb chaos, slow down the room, and project clear, focus calm, you become an emotional anchor for the organization. Skills can be outsourced, and stabilizing presence during a storm cannot. Eighth, communicate the why behind your data. Anyone can run a report and hand over a spreadsheet of numbers, but numbers without a narrative are just noise. The people who stand out are those who can look at the data, extract the human story, and explain why it matters for the future. When you speak in insights rather than raw information, you stop acting like a processor and start acting like an advisor. Ninth, maintain a high rate of relevant learning. The half-life of professional skills is shrinking faster than ever. If you rely solely on what you knew 2 years ago, you are already falling behind. Indispensable people don't wait for formal training programs. They are constantly, quietly learning adjacent skills that complement their core work. They evolve faster than the organization's challenges evolve. Finally, treat everything you build as a product, not a chore. Whether you are designing a complex software system or writing a weekly status email, approach it with a standard of excellence that reflects your personal signature. When everything attached to your name carries a distinct level of clarity, thoughtfulness, and polish, your absence leaves an immediately noticeable, uncomfortable gap in quality. We do not become irreplaceable by hoarding our duties or shouting about our achievements. We become irreplaceable by deepening our value to the human beings around us. When you stop focusing on making yourself look good and start focusing on making the collective mission succeed, you transcend your job title. You stop being a resource that the company pays for, and you become part of the identity of the organization itself. 5 keynotes of the speech: from task execution to context mastery, indispensability is achieved by shifting focus from what you do, the job description, to why and how you do it, specifically by understanding the unwritten human dynamics and hidden context of the organization. The power of silo bridging. Value increases exponentially when an individual stops looking down at their specific silo and instead looks across the organization to connect disparate teams, ideas, and data points. Trust is the ultimate retention tool. While technical competencies are easily outsourced or automated, deep emotional trustworthiness, characterized by radical accountability, calm under pressure, and selfless intent, is nearly impossible to replace. The multiplier effect. True career security comes not from hoarding knowledge to remain essential, but from actively mentoring and optimizing the performance of the entire team, making yourself the focal point of collective success. Evolution over stagnation. To remain irreplaceable, an individual must maintain an autonomous, continuous learning loop that outpaces the natural evolution of the company's organizational challenges. To truly understand why some people are effortlessly retained while others are easily let go, we have to look past the surface of daily deliverables. Most professionals operate under the assumption that fulfilling their specific job description is the ultimate measure of career security. They arrive on time, check off their assigned tasks, meet their explicit key performance indicators, and believe that this alignment makes them invaluable. But a job description is merely a transactional contract. It defines the bare minimum requirement for a role to exist, and because it is codified on paper, it can be handed to almost anyone with similar baseline credentials. When you restrict your contribution to the literal execution of tasks, you remain a standardized component in a larger mechanism, inherently vulnerable to organizational shifting or technological replacement. Becoming genuinely indispensable requires a fundamental shift in perspective from the explicit to the implicit, moving from basic task execution to the mastery of hidden context. Every organization, regardless of its size or industry, functions on two entirely separate tracks. The first is the formal structure, which is easily visible on an organizational chart. It dictates who reports to whom, defines budget lines, and outlines official protocols. The second, far more influential track is the unwritten web of human relationships, cultural nuances, hidden frustrations, and systemic motivations that actually drives daily progress. The people who become impossible to replace are those who consciously choose to study this second invisible layer. They do not just ask what needs to be done, they obsess over why it needs to be done and how it impacts the broader collective ecosystem. Mastering this hidden context changes how you diagnose problems. When an organization faces a challenge, the typical employee reacts to the immediate symptom presented to them. If a report is late or a client is unhappy, they treat it as an isolated incident to be managed and forgotten. A context master, however, looks at the entire field. They recognize that a late report might actually be the result of a communication breakdown between two specific departments, or that a client's frustration stems from a deeper, unexpressed anxiety about their own industry's future. By understanding the underlying human dynamics and historical friction points within the company, you gain the unique ability to trace a symptom back to its origin. You begin solving the real, systemic issues before anyone else has even properly identified them, effectively shielding the leadership team from friction they didn't even know was coming. Furthermore, this mastery fundamentally alters the value of your daily output. When you understand the deeper context behind a directive, your execution ceases to be rigid. You gain the autonomy to adjust your approach in real time because you know the ultimate intent behind the goal. If a manager asks for data, a standard employee provides a spreadsheet. A context master provides a specific insight that directly addresses the manager's current unspoken pressure point. This level of alignment creates an intense psychological reliance. Leaders and colleagues quickly realize that you do not just follow instructions blindly. You actively protect the team from missteps by anchoring your work in the reality of the organization's true environment. Ultimately, moving from task execution to context mastery is an act of deep empathy and strategic observation. It requires you to look beyond your own desk, silence the urge to simply clear your inbox, and actively listen to the rhythm of the room. You become an interpreter of the company's unexpressed needs and a guardian of its cultural stability. When you possess the unique ability to navigate the complex social and operational terrain of an organization, you transcend the boundaries of your job title. You are no longer evaluated merely by the volume of work you produce, but by the clarity, foresight, and stability you bring to the entire operation. The company cannot easily replace you with an outside candidate or an automated tool because an outsider only brings skills, whereas you possess the irreplaceable blueprint of the organization's living history and human reality. The modern corporate world is built on the foundation of specialization. From the moment we enter the workforce, we are encouraged to find our niche, sharpen our specific skill sets, and dig deep into our chosen fields. This hyper-focus creates an environment of silos where departments become self-contained kingdoms, operating with their own distinct languages, priorities, and biases. Engineers speak in code and architecture, marketers think in campaigns and conversion rates, sales teams focus entirely on quotas, and finance looks strictly at margin preservation. Because of this division, the average professional spends their entire day looking straight down at their own desk, completely blind to how their work impacts or is impacted by the rest of the organization. While this specialization allows for individual efficiency, it creates massive systemic fragmentation across the company. When an organization becomes a collection of isolated silos, immense friction occurs at the boundaries where these departments are supposed to meet. Projects stall, miscommunications multiply, and valuable energy is wasted simply trying to get different teams to understand one another. This structural weakness is precisely where the opportunity for true indispensability lies. The individuals who become completely irreplaceable are not necessarily the absolute best technical experts within a single silo. Rather, they are the rare individuals who choose to lift their heads up, look across the entire organizational landscape, and become chief dot connectors. They recognize that the greatest untapped value in any company does not exist inside the individual departments, but in the white spaces that lie between them. To bridge these gaps effectively, a dot connector must develop a form of professional bilingualism. They make it their mission to understand the core motivations, pressures, and vocabularies of adjacent teams. When you take the time to learn why the engineering team is pushing back on a timeline or why the sales team is desperate for a specific product feature, you stop viewing other departments as obstacles and start viewing them as partners. This horizontal perspective allows you to serve as a vital human translation layer. When a conflict arises between two siloed teams, the dot connector is the only person in the room who can stand in the middle, synthesize the fragmented arguments, and translate them into a singular, cohesive narrative that serves the overarching mission of the company. You become the connective tissue that transforms a group of disparate factions into a unified organism. This ability to see the whole picture completely changes how you solve problems and generate ideas. Innovation rarely happens in a vacuum. It almost always occurs when ideas from one discipline are cross-pollinated with another. By sitting at the intersection of multiple departments, the dot connector notices patterns, redundancies, and opportunities that are completely invisible to those trapped inside their specific silos. You might realize that a tool the customer service team is using could instantly solve a data tracking problem the marketing team has been struggling with for months. You begin to see how a minor adjustment in the product development phase could prevent a massive bottleneck in the fulfillment pipeline later on, because you can see how all the pieces fit together, your strategic value skyrockets. Ultimately, bridging silos is an act of proactive leadership that completely transcends a traditional job description. It requires a willingness to step out of your comfort zone, ask questions about areas outside your expertise, and take responsibility for collaborative success. When you become a dot connector, your value to the organization is no longer tied to a single, easily replaceable task or isolated function. Instead, you become the operational linchpin holding different teams together. Leadership quickly realizes that without your presence, communication breaks down, projects slow to a crawl, and the organizational silos naturally close back up. By anchoring yourself at the crossroads of the company's collective intelligence, you make yourself a foundational pillar of the business, rendering your position fundamentally secure. In any organization, competence is the baseline expectation. When a company hires you, they do so under the assumption that you possess the necessary skills to perform the duties outlined in your job description. You are expected to hit your benchmarks, manage your time, and deliver consistent results. But competence, as critical as it is ultimately a commodity. Skills can be taught, workflows can be optimized, and technical expertise can be outsourced or automated. If your value to an organization is based entirely on your technical track record, your position remains transactional. To transition from being merely useful to becoming fundamentally irreplaceable, you must shift your focus from building a track record of competence to cultivating an unshakable foundation of deep systemic trust. Trust is the invisible currency of successful organizations, and it operates on a layer far deeper than mere execution. While competence is about what you can do, trust is about who you are when things get difficult. It is built in the moments of friction, uncertainty, and crisis. One of the most powerful ways to build this trust is by taking radical accountability for the gray areas of the business. Every organization has operational gaps, those ambiguous, ill-defined problems that do not clearly belong to any specific department or individual. Most people actively avoid these areas because they carry risk without explicit reward. The typical employee waits for permission or explicit instructions before stepping outside their box. However, the individuals who become impossible to replace are those who willingly step into these chaotic spaces and say, I will figure this out. When you take ownership of a problem that is nobody's job but everyone's headache, you instantly relieve a massive psychological burden from leadership. You become the person who absorbs anxiety rather than creating it. Furthermore, true trust requires an unwavering commitment to emotional sovereignty and calm under pressure. When a crisis hits, whether it is a major client threatening to leave, a critical system failure, or a sudden shift in the market, the natural human reaction is panic. In these moments, standard metrics and track records lose their meaning. What leadership desperately needs is an emotional anchor. If you can train yourself to slow down when everyone else is speeding up, to listen clearly, and to project a focused, constructive calm, you change the entire dynamic of the room. You become a stabilizing presence that people naturally gravitate toward. This ability to handle high-stakes chaos without losing your perspective cannot be automated, and it cannot be easily found in a pile of resumes. It is a rare human quality that makes you a foundational asset to the team's survival. Deep trust also manifests in how you handle truth and communication. A track record might tell a leader that you can deliver a project on time, but trust tells a leader that you will give them an honest, empathetic assessment of a situation, even when the truth is uncomfortable to hear. In many corporate environments, people default to self-preservation, hiding mistakes, or telling leadership exactly what they want to hear. A truly trustworthy individual operates with selfless intent, prioritizing the health of the mission and the team over their personal comfort. When leaders know that your feedback is completely free of hidden agendas, political posturing, or fragile ego, your voice carries immense weight. They stop viewing you as a subordinate who executes tasks and begin treating you as a critical advisor whose counsel is vital to the organization's decision-making process. Ultimately, anyone can learn a skill or build a portfolio of successful projects over time, but not everyone can be trusted to protect the culture, handle a crisis with grace, and take ownership of systemic failures. When your colleagues and leaders know that your word is absolute, that your intentions are purely aligned with the collective success, and that you will steady the ship during a storm, they develop a profound psychological reliance on you. They realize that while they could find another person with your exact technical credentials, they cannot easily replace the psychological safety, integrity, and stability you bring to the ecosystem. By intentionally cultivating deep trust through radical accountability and selfless leadership, you embed yourself into the very identity of the organization, securing a position that no one would ever want to fill with someone else. The natural instinct for self-preservation in the workplace often leads people to a very specific defensive strategy, knowledge hoarding. Many professionals believe that if they are the only person who knows how to operate a specific system, manage a critical client, or run a particular process, they can make themselves completely safe from termination or replacement. They intentionally guard their shortcuts, keep their methodologies vague, and ensure that they remain a bottleneck for key operational tasks. But this strategy is entirely counterintuitive. In reality, hoarding knowledge does not make you irreplaceable. It makes you a liability. When an individual creates an artificial dependency around themselves, they become a source of systemic risk for the organization. Leadership quickly realizes that this person is a constraint on the company's growth and agility, and they will immediately begin working behind the scenes to document those processes, automate those tasks, or train someone else to eliminate the single point of failure. True sustainable indispensability is born from a paradox: the more you give away, the more secure you become. To transcend your job title and become a foundational asset to an organization, you must shift your focus entirely from self-protection to the multiplier effect. This means actively optimizing for the success of the human beings around you. Instead of guarding your insights, you make it your personal mission to share your shortcuts, document your best practices, and lift the operational and emotional baseline of the entire room. When you step into the role of a natural mentor, you stop measuring your worth by your individual output and start measuring it by the collective output of the team you support. When you intentionally pour your knowledge into others, you change the math of your value to the company. A standard employee operates on addition. They add their specific labor to the company's goals. A multiplier operates on multiplication. If you can train, inspire, and elevate 3 other people so that they are each performing 30% better, you are no longer just delivering the value of one person. You are directly responsible for a massive spike in collective organizational capability. Leadership will never replace a person who makes everyone around them twice as good. If a company lets an individual contributor go, they only have to replace 1 unit of productivity. But if they lose a multiplier, the performance of the entire department degrades, morale drops, and the internal engine of growth slows down. By making yourself the focal point of collective success, you create a deep, structural reliance on your presence that goes far beyond any single project or task. Furthermore, this approach fundamentally changes how you are perceived by leadership. When you spend your time lifting others up, you are practicing leadership from wherever you sit, regardless of whether you have an official management title. You become the person who builds community, fosters psychological safety, and drives cultural alignment. People naturally gravitate toward you because you make them feel more capable, confident, and valued in their own roles. This creates an intense groundswell of loyalty and trust from your peers. You become an essential strand in the social fabric of the organization. When leadership looks at you, they do not see a resource that they are paying for to hit a metric. They see a cultural pillar who is actively preserving and growing the company's most valuable asset, its human capital. Ultimately, shifting from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of multiplication requires a great deal of professional maturity and a genuine commitment to the overarching mission. It requires you to silence the ego that demands to be the only star in the room and instead find fulfillment in seeing the entire team shine. By breaking down the barriers of knowledge hoarding and choosing to invest heavily in the growth of your colleagues, you transition from being a functional component of the company to becoming part of its identity. You become the linchpin that holds the collective unit together, establishing a level of career security that can never be replicated by simply clinging to your daily chores. The world we operate in is changing at an unprecedented velocity. Technologies that were considered cutting edge a few years ago are now obsolete. Market conditions shift overnight. And the administrative or technical challenges an organization faces today bear very little resemblance to the challenges it faced in the past. In this climate of rapid acceleration, the half-life of professional skills is shrinking faster than ever before. Many professionals fall into the trap of stagnation because they rely entirely on the accumulated knowledge that got them hired in the first place. They master a specific software, perfect a set workflow, or adapt to a singular operational style, and then they coast on that expertise. But when an individual's growth curve plateaus while the company's challenge curve continues to climb, a dangerous gap opens up. The moment your current skill set no longer matches the evolving complexity of the organization's problems, your history of good performance ceases to matter. You become a legacy asset in a forward-looking environment, which makes you highly vulnerable to replacement. To remain fundamentally irreplaceable over the long term, you must establish an autonomous, continuous learning loop that consistently outpaces the natural evolution of the company's organizational challenges. This requires a total abandonment of the passive mindset that waits for formal corporate training, annual reviews, or explicit directives before acquiring new capabilities. Indispensable individuals do not wait for the organization to realize it has a knowledge deficit. They actively look ahead, anticipate where the industry and the company are moving, and quietly begin upskilling themselves in adjacent areas before the need even becomes public. If you are a designer, you don't just master current visual software, you begin studying user psychology or data analytics. If you are an engineer, you don't just write clean code, you learn the financial metrics that drive product strategy. By constantly extending your expertise into adjacent territories, you expand your conceptual bandwidth and ensure that you are always prepared to solve the next generation of company problems. This commitment to continuous evolution fundamentally alters your relationship with institutional change. When a company undergoes a major transition, whether it is restructuring, adopting artificial intelligence, or pivoting its core product offering, the average employee reacts with fear, resistance, and friction. They cling to the old way of doing things because their identity and security are tied to those old methods. A person committed to constant learning, however, views organizational disruption as an invitation because they have already trained their brain to adapt, absorb new information, and throw away outdated habits. They become the first people to lean into the chaos. While everyone else is mourning the past, the continuous learner is already mastering the new tools, understanding the new strategy, and positioning themselves as the guide who can help the rest of the team transition safely into the future. Furthermore, maintaining a high rate of relevant learning transforms you into an irreplaceable intellectual anchor for leadership. When executives are trying to navigate unfamiliar market shifts or implement new operational models, they look for individuals who can provide fresh, informed perspectives without requiring a steep learning curve. When you routinely bring external insights, cross-disciplinary knowledge, and proactive solutions to the table, you cease to be viewed as a static resource that executes orders. Instead, you are recognized as a strategic thinker who actively helps the organization evolve its own internal capabilities. You become a primary driver of the company's competitive advantage. Ultimately, staying irreplaceable is not a status you achieve once and keep forever. It is a daily active practice of self-disruption. It requires the humility to admit that what you knew yesterday is not enough for tomorrow, and the discipline to consistently invest time in your own intellectual growth. When you choose to outlearn the problems of your organization, you build a form of career equity that is entirely immune to automation, outsourcing, or shifting corporate structures. You stop running to catch up with the company's trajectory and instead become the engine that pulls the organization forward into its next chapter, cementing a position of security that can never be replicated. Ultimately, making yourself harder to replace is not about working longer hours, hoarding secrets, or aggressively defending your territory. It is about a fundamental shift from self-preservation to collective contribution. When you choose to master the hidden context of your environment, bridge the gaps between isolated teams, build unshakable trust through radical accountability, multiply the capability of those around you, and relentlessly learn the problems of tomorrow, your value transcends the boundaries of a standard job description. You stop being a resource that the company pays for, and you become a vital part of the organization's identity. In a world full of easily replaceable components, choose to be the linchpin that holds the entire mission together.